We all learned a simple story about Thanksgiving, a cheerful feast of pilgrims and Native Americans, sharing food in harmony. This myth, repeated in schools and media, paints a picture of unity and gratitude, with Squanto as the helpful native friend. But as we grow older, we realize this story is a sanitized version, glossing over the harsh realities of colonization. The truth is far more complex. The Pilgrims were not gentle guests, and the so-called First Thanksgiving was not a symbol of lasting peace. Malcolm X's words, "We didn't land on Plymouth Rock landed on us," remind us to question who truly paid the price for this national myth. The real story behind Thanksgiving is messy and contested. The 1621 feast was not a Thanksgiving, as the Pilgrims understood it, but a tense, brief gathering after a misunderstanding. The Wampanoag attended not as invited guests, but as wary allies responding to gunfire, ready for battle. The native peoples had their own ancient harvest traditions, and their world had already been devastated by disease and violence brought by earlier European contact. The alliance was a fragile pause, not the start of a tradition of friendship, the reality. This moment was a rare truce in a relationship soon marked by betrayal and conquest. Long before the Mayflower, New England was home to thriving indigenous nations with rich cultures and complex societies. The land was not empty, it was shaped and sustained by native hands for thousands of years. The Pilgrims entered a world with established villages, agriculture, and political systems, none of which fit the myth of a new world. The Thanksgiving story erases this deep history, ignoring that colonization was a violent interruption, not a beginning. True understanding starts by acknowledging the ancient civilizations whose world was shattered by the arrival of the colonizers. Decades before the Pilgrims, European contact brought violence, kidnapping, and, most devastatingly, disease. Epidemics like smallpox wiped out up to 95% of coastal native populations, leaving villages empty and societies in chaos. The Pilgrims settled on land made available only by this catastrophe, seeing it as divine providence. The Wampanoag, weakened and desperate, allied with the newcomers out of survival, not friendship. The foundation of Plymouth was built on the ruins of a devastated world. Tisquantum, or Squanto, is often cast as a friendly helper, but his real story is one of trauma and survival. Kidnapped and sold into slavery in Europe, he returned years later to find his entire village wiped out by disease. Alone and grieving, he became an intermediary between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag, navigating a dangerous political landscape. His actions were driven by necessity and loss, not simple goodwill. Squanto's life reveals the true cost of colonization, survival amid devastation, not a tale of happy cooperation. The Wampanoag weren't invited to a friendly feast. Instead, gunfire from the Pilgrims' celebration alarmed them, prompting their leader Usamequin to arrive with 90 warriors, ready for conflict, not dinner. The resulting feast was a tense, diplomatic necessity, not a gesture of goodwill. The Wampanoag's presence showed who truly held power. The Thanksgiving meal we know today is a modern invention. In 1621, the table was rustic. No pumpkin pie, no mashed potatoes, no cranberry sauce. The real feast featured wild game, seafood, and native crops, thanks to the Wampanoag's knowledge and the land's bounty. Without the Wampanoag, there would have been no feast, no survival. Their contributions shaped the first Thanksgiving. In 1621, Pilgrims and Wampanoag leaders formed a fragile alliance, not a friendship, born from mutual desperation and vulnerability. Their treaty was a calculated pact for survival, not a brotherly bond. The famous feast was a brief moment of peace, not the start of a lasting tradition. The alliance soon gave way to broken promises, violence, and dispossession for the Wampanoag. The Peace of 1621 was short-lived. As settlers arrived, conflict with native peoples grew, leading to the brutal Pequot War. On May 26, 1637, English colonists and allies destroyed a Pequot village, killing hundreds. The massacre's aftermath was marked by a day of Thanksgiving, celebrating not harvest, but bloodshed. The Mystic Massacre was not an isolated incident, but the beginning of a new and horrifying chapter in colonial native relations. The sheer brutality of the attack sent a clear message to all indigenous peoples in the region. Resistance to English expansion would be met with overwhelming and indiscriminate violence. The war against the Pequot continued after the massacre, becoming a campaign of annihilation. English soldiers hunted down the scattered survivors, killing many and selling hundreds more into slavery in the West Indies. The Pequot name was outlawed, and their lands were divided among the colonists and their allies. The goal was not just defeat, but complete erasure. This pattern of violence and dispossession accelerated throughout the 17th century. The balance of power, which had once favored the Wampanoag and other tribes, shifted decisively. As the Negropean population swelled with new arrivals, their settlements pushed deeper into native territories. The colonists' livestock destroyed native cornfields, and English courts systematically stripped tribes of their land through fraudulent deals and legal manipulation. The friendly hand that had once offered food was now clenching into a fist. The initial alliance, born of mutual need, was replaced by a relationship of dominance and subjugation, where the English dictated the terms and the native peoples were forced to retreat. The English also began a campaign of cultural warfare. They established praying towns to convert Native Americans to Christianity, forcing them to abandon their spiritual beliefs, language, and traditional way of life. This was a form of assimilation designed to break down indigenous social structures and make them easier to control. The colonists passed laws that made native spiritual practices illegal and undermined the authority of traditional leaders. This assault on their culture was just as devastating as the physical violence, attacking the very core of what it meant to be Wampanoag, Narragansett, or Nipmuc. It was a systematic effort to destroy their identity from the inside out. The growing English arrogance and their relentless pressure on native lands and life created an atmosphere of deep resentment and despair. The promises made in the 1621 treaty were now meaningless. The children of the Pilgrims who had been saved from starvation by the Wampanoag now saw them as obstacles to be removed. The brief moment of peace at Plymouth had fully given way to a cycle of betrayal. The stage was being set for an even larger, more devastating conflict that would engulf the entire region, a final, desperate struggle for the very survival of the indigenous peoples of the Dawnland. In 1675, Metacom, King Philip, led a desperate alliance of tribes against the English, sparking King Philip's War. The conflict was brutal, devastating native peoples and settlements. Metacom was killed, his head displayed as a warning. Survivors were enslaved, and native independence in New England was shattered forever. The end of King Philip's War marked the definitive end of native sovereignty in most of New England. The conflict left the surviving indigenous communities broken, scattered, and powerless. The colonists seized the vast majority of the remaining native land as spoils of war, opening it up for unchecked settlement and expansion. The few surviving native people were forced onto small, designated parcels of land, the precursors to reservations. They were subjected to strict colonial oversight, their movements restricted, and their ability to govern themselves completely stripped away. The era of diplomacy and negotiation was over. The era of total subjugation had begun. Following the war, the process of forced assimilation intensified. The English colonists systematically worked to erase native culture, which they viewed as savage and satanic. They banned the speaking of Algonquian languages and the practice of traditional ceremonies. Native children were often forced into indentured servitude in English homes, where they were indoctrinated with colonial values and religion, severing them from their families and heritage. The goal was to absorb the remnants of the native population into the lowest rungs of colonial society, thereby eliminating them as distinct peoples. This cultural genocide was a deliberate policy designed to complete the conquest that military force had started. The history of this betrayal and violence was then systemically rewritten. Colonial historians and writers began crafting a narrative that justified their actions. They portrayed the native people as treacherous savages who had rejected English kindness and civilization. They romanticized the early years, like the 1621 feast, creating a myth of initial friendship that was supposedly betrayed by the natives, not the other way around. This falsified history served to legitimize the theft of land and the destruction of indigenous societies. It transformed a story of brutal conquest into a heroic tale of founding a new nation in the face of savagery, a myth that would become central to American identity. This legacy of lost land and cultural erasure is the dark shadow that hangs over the Thanksgiving holiday. The story of a peaceful meal shared between two equal groups masks the reality of a relationship that was, from the start, tilted toward a violent colonial takeover. The Wampanoag and other native nations were not just defeated, they were systematically dispossessed, enslaved, and nearly erased from the land and from history. The path from the 1621 feast to the display of Metacom's head in Plymouth is a direct one, tracing the tragic journey from a moment of cautious peace to a future of betrayal, violence, and loss. Thanksgiving was once a regional New England custom, not a national holiday. That changed in 1863 when President Lincoln, inspired by Sarah Josepha Hale's campaign, proclaimed a National Day of Thanks, hoping to unite a divided nation. Yet, this unity ignored ongoing injustices against indigenous peoples, revealing a complex legacy behind the holiday. Just before Lincoln's Thanksgiving proclamation, the Dakota War erupted in Minnesota, born from broken treaties and starvation. 38 Dakota men were hanged in the largest mass execution in U.S. history. For Native Americans, Thanksgiving's origins are forever tied to this dark injustice and loss. Section 3. From Proclamation to National Tradition. Following Lincoln's 1863 proclamation, Thanksgiving began to solidify its place as an annual American tradition. Presidents succeeding Lincoln continued to issue annual proclamations, and the last Thursday in November became the unofficially recognized date. The holiday's narrative, heavily promoted in schools, newspapers, and popular culture, focused almost exclusively on the sanitized myth of the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag. This story was a powerful tool for assimilation, teaching waves of immigrants and generations of children a simplified, patriotic version of American history that emphasized unity and peaceful beginnings while conveniently omitting the violence, theft, and genocide that followed. The commercialization of the holiday soon followed, further cementing its place in the national consciousness. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Thanksgiving was becoming a major economic event. The elite bankers and financial institutions at the center of the American economy quickly learned to capitalize on the holiday. They profited immensely from the surge in consumer spending on food, travel, and eventually, the holiday shopping season that kicked off the next day. Banks earned massive revenues from credit card interest and interchange fees as people financed their holiday feasts and Black Friday purchases, turning a day of supposed gratitude into a major engine of consumer debt and corporate profit. The date of the holiday, however, remained subject to presidential whim until the 20th century. In 1939, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, hoping to boost the economy during the Great Depression by extending the Christmas shopping season, moved Thanksgiving from the last Thursday of November to the 3rd. This move proved highly controversial, with many states refusing to recognize the new date, leading to a confusing period where the country celebrated Thanksgiving on two different days. The ensuing public and political backlash demonstrated just how deeply entrenched the holiday, and its traditional date, had become in the American psyche. To resolve the confusion and standardize the holiday once and for all, Congress took action. In 1941, it passed a joint resolution, which Roosevelt signed into law, officially declaring that Thanksgiving would be celebrated on the fourth Thursday of every November. This act of Congress made Thanksgiving a permanent official national holiday, legally binding for the entire country. The journey from a bloody colonial Thanksgiving to a presidential proclamation, and finally to a fixed federal holiday, was complete. The myth of a peaceful, shared meal had been successfully enshrined as a cornerstone of American civil religion, obscuring its political origins and painful history. For many, Thanksgiving means family and gratitude, but for many indigenous people, it's a painful reminder of genocide, land theft, and cultural erasure. The National Day of Mourning protests this history, honoring ancestors and challenging the myth of Thanksgiving. For them, it's a day to remember loss and demand truth. Native Americans are not a monolith. Some protest Thanksgiving, others gather with family, or use the day for education and reclamation. Chefs encourage decolonizing the feast, centering indigenous foods and stories. The goal: move beyond myths, honor truth, and celebrate togetherness, gratitude, and indigenous resilience. Understanding Thanksgiving's painful history is just the start. True change means taking action. Support Native voices, read their books, share their art, and listen to their stories. Choose indigenous businesses and support Native-led organizations. Let's honor truth, support Native sovereignty, and celebrate Indigenous resilience every day. The Thanksgiving story we know is a myth that hides a painful history, one of colonization, stolen land, and broken treaties. Honoring the truth means listening to Native voices and building a future rooted in respect, gratitude, and honest reflection. Only then can Thanksgiving become a day of genuine unity and healing.